For years, Donald Trump talked about wars, borders, and power abroad. Now suddenly, he is talking about your credit card bill, your rent, your mortgage. At first glance, it looks like a pivot. In reality, it is something far more dangerous and far more revealing. Trump is attacking institutional investors buying homes. He is calling for a 10% cap on credit card interest rates. He is flirting with cracking down on Wall Street's fee machine. These are not conservative talking points. They are populist grenades, and he is throwing them without warning, not just at Democrats, but at his own party. Here is the paradox. Trump wants to run as the defender of ordinary Americans, but the system he needs to change belongs to Republicans who don't want it changed. If you want to understand where American politics is heading, don't look at the speeches. Look at the fracture beneath them. Stay with me, because to understand this clash, we first need to define what this fight is really about. What Trump is doing right now is not a policy rollout. It is a political stress test. The question is not whether these proposals will pass. The question is what they expose. On one side, you have Trump's message: affordability, anger at elites, suspicion of Wall Street, frustration with a system that feels rigged. On the other, you have the Republican Party's governing reality: donors, financial markets, regulatory rollback, and a Congress designed to move slowly, if at all. These two forces are now colliding in public. Trump is speaking directly to voters who feel squeezed by high interest rates and rising housing costs. But Congress speaks a different language, one of committees, legislation, and market consequences. And here is the core tension: populism thrives on confrontation. Governance depends on cooperation. Trump is betting that talking about fighting Wall Street may matter more than actually beating it. His party, however, is built to protect the very system he is criticizing. To understand how we got here, we need to step back and look at the deeper history that made this moment inevitable. This conflict did not appear overnight. It is the product of a long economic cycle and a political one. For decades, both parties embraced a model where growth mattered more than distribution. Cheap credit, rising asset prices, a financial system that rewarded scale, speed, and capital. That model worked until it didn't. As housing became an investment class, institutional money flowed in. As interest rates climbed, credit cards turned into lifelines and traps. And as costs rose faster than wages, the economy began to feel disconnected from everyday life. Trump did not create this system, but he understands its emotional fault lines. In his first term, Republicans delivered tax cuts and deregulation. Markets cheered, voters felt less certain. Now, with midterms approaching, the old formula feels insufficient. Affordability has replaced growth as the political keyword, even if Trump publicly mocks the term. The problem is structural. The Republican Party is optimized for free markets. Trump is optimized for breaking consensus. Those two instincts could coexist when rhetoric stayed symbolic. They cannot when proposals threaten the financial core. And that sets the stage for the first real rupture. The rupture arrived quietly and then all at once. Republican lawmakers woke up to find themselves defending a party platform they had not approved: a credit card interest cap, restrictions on institutional housing investors, an investigation targeting the Federal Reserve chair, ideas that require legislation, ideas that threaten donors, ideas that no one on Capitol Hill had been briefed on. Behind closed doors, frustration boiled over. Some Republicans called the proposals ridiculous, others dismissed them as noise. A few simply shrugged and said, "Let him talk." This was not a policy disagreement. It was a warning signal. Trump was speaking in populist language. Congress was operating in institutional time, and the gap between them was suddenly visible. One senator admitted Congress could no longer just cheer from the sidelines. If Trump wanted results, lawmakers would have to act, and many had no intention of doing so. Here's the irony. The more Trump pushed against Wall Street, the more isolated he became inside his own party. If this feels chaotic, pause for a moment, because what looks like confusion is actually a system revealing its true logic. If you want to understand why this keeps happening in American politics, keep watching, because next we need to uncover the mechanism hiding underneath all of this. What you are watching is not dysfunction, it is design. The American political system rewards signaling far more than delivery, and Trump understands this better than almost anyone. By floating populist proposals, he forces every actor to reveal their position. Wall Street panics, lobbyists mobilize, Republican leaders distance themselves, voters see conflict and choose sides emotionally, not legislatively. Notice the mechanism at work. Nothing has to pass. No bill has to survive committee. The confrontation itself is the product. Trump's power does not come from Congress. It comes from attention, from framing, from the ability to define who is for you and who is against you. When Republicans resist, they do not weaken him. They validate his narrative, and when Wall Street reacts with alarm, it confirms the populist message that entrenched interests feel threatened. This is why advisors can push affordability while Trump mocks the word. The substance matters less than the signal. But here is the risk embedded in this strategy. When politics becomes pure theater, reality eventually pushes back, and it does so violently, because next comes the second crisis, not inside Washington, but in how this fight spills outward. The second crisis is quieter and more dangerous. As proposals stack up without a legislative path, confusion replaces clarity. Markets don't know what to price, lawmakers don't know what to defend, and institutions begin to brace, not because laws are changing, but because signals are. Wall Street's reaction tells the story. Even the idea of capping interest rates or restricting fees is enough to trigger alarm, not because it will happen tomorrow, but because it breaks a taboo. For decades, finance operated with one assumption: both parties ultimately protect the system. Now that assumption is cracking. Inside Congress, Republicans respond by accelerating what they control: deregulation, tax cuts, familiar terrain. Outside Congress, Trump escalates the rhetoric, hinting at more plans, more fights, more disruption. Two tracks, one party, and in between them, a growing credibility gap. This is where instability lives, not in radical change, but in mixed signals. When power centers speak different languages, trust erodes. And once trust erodes, coordination fails. What began as an internal party conflict now starts to leak outward into how people experience the economy itself, because the real consequences of this clash are not felt in hearing rooms or trading floors. They are felt somewhere much closer to home, and that is where we need to go next. If you are watching this from your kitchen table, this fight is not abstract. It shows up every month. You feel it when your credit card balance barely moves no matter how much you pay, when rent rises faster than your paycheck, when buying a home feels like competing against invisible giants with unlimited cash, while Washington argues you absorb the cost. Trump talks about capping interest rates and blocking institutional buyers because those ideas sound like relief. Congress hesitates because the system that profits from your debt also funds their campaigns, and you are caught in the middle. This is why the messaging works. Not because it is implemented, but because it names a pain people already live with. You don't need to understand banking policy to know when the game feels unfair. You don't need a spreadsheet to feel squeezed. That is the emotional core of this moment, a growing gap between economic headlines and lived reality. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Even if nothing changes, the anger doesn't disappear. It compounds. If this resonates with you, pause for a second, share this, because understanding the system is the first step toward not being blindsided by it. But this story doesn't stop at your wallet, because when domestic frustration meets global power, the consequences travel far beyond American borders. What happens inside America never stays inside America for long. When the world's largest economy sends mixed signals, everyone feels it. Markets abroad watch Washington for coherence. Allies watch for predictability. Rivals watch for weakness. Trump's populist turn, even if symbolic, introduces uncertainty into a system that runs on expectations. If Wall Street's privileges are no longer politically untouchable, capital recalculates risk. If the Federal Reserve becomes a political target, confidence in monetary independence wobbles. None of this requires laws to pass. Perception alone is enough. At the same time, America's internal division limits its external focus. Energy that once went into diplomacy is redirected inward toward affordability, resentment, and domestic pressure. And that creates openings. Global finance adjusts, foreign governments hedge, economic influence fragments. This is how domestic populism quietly becomes geopolitical force, not through confrontation, but through distraction. A country arguing with itself cannot fully project stability abroad. The deeper story here is not Trump versus Republicans. It is a system struggling to reconcile democratic anger with institutional power under global scrutiny. So the question becomes unavoidable: what happens next? Because this path does not lead to a single outcome, but to several possible futures. And understanding them may be the most important part of this entire conversation. From here, the system can move in three very different directions. The first is containment. Trump continues the populist rhetoric. Congress quietly ignores most of it. Markets calm down. Nothing structural changes, but the messaging helps Republicans in tight races. Populism becomes a campaign tool, not a governing one. The system absorbs the shock and moves on. The second path is partial rupture. One or two ideas slip through: a vote on swipe fees, a symbolic housing restriction, enough to prove action, not enough to rewrite the rules. This satisfies voters temporarily, while deepening internal party tension. Governance becomes uneven, trust erodes slowly. The third path is full collision. Populist pressure intensifies. Trump doubles down. Republican resistance hardens. Markets react sharply to sustained uncertainty. What began as signaling turns into real instability, not because of radical laws, but because coordination fails. Here is the systemic insight: modern democracies are most fragile not when they choose change, but when they can't decide whether to change. Indecision is its own form of disruption. Which future emerges depends less on Trump's speeches and more on whether institutions can realign with public reality without breaking themselves. And that brings us to the final question: what should you take away from all of this? Because this story is not ending here. This moment is not about whether Trump's ideas pass. It is about what they reveal. They expose a political system caught between two truths. One, millions of Americans feel the economy no longer works for them. Two, the institutions running that economy are deeply resistant to disruption. Trump sits in the middle of that tension, not as a solution, but as a signal. He shows how modern power works. You don't need laws to shape reality. You need attention, conflict, and a story people recognize as their own. For you, the lesson is not partisan. It is structural. When politics becomes performance, outcomes matter less than perception. And when institutions ignore lived experience for too long, someone will weaponize that gap. This clash is not ending with this election cycle. It is the beginning of a longer renegotiation between citizens, markets, and power. If you want to understand where the economy and democracy are heading, keep paying attention to these fractures. If this helped you see the system more clearly, share it and follow for the next breakdown, because the next phase will be even more consequential than this one.